My name is Clara Reed, and I bought a house to be alone. Not in a sad, pathetic way, or at least I tried to tell myself that. It was a strategic retreat, a deliberate untangling from the life I'd shared with Michael. His life, really, his friends, his booming laugh that filled every room. His habit of leaving half-empty coffee cups on every available surface as if marking his territory. After the divorce, the silence in our cavernous, architect-designed house was louder than his laughter had ever been. It was a hollow, echoing thing full of memories I was desperate to escape. So I found this place, a small, two-bedroom bungalow on a street named, almost comically, Tranquility Court. It was modest, with a postage stamp lawn and a slightly overgrown garden that I promised myself I'd learn to love. For the first week, it was perfect. It was a sanctuary. The quiet was a soft blanket, not a gaping wound. I set up my graphic design studio in the spare bedroom overlooking the backyard. The hum of my computer, a comforting, productive drone. I worked when I wanted, slept when it was tiered, and ate cereal for dinner without a single comment on my nutritional choices. It was bliss dot slash slash a fragile tentative bliss, but mine nonetheless. My first encounter with my next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, happened on moving day. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a tightly trimmed white mustache and eyes that seemed to be in a permanent state of shrewd assessment. He watched from his porch as the movers, a pair of cheerful, muscular young men, wrestled my sofa through the front door. That's an awfully big truck for such a small house. He called out, his voice a dry rasp. There was no warmth in it, no welcome dot slash slash. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a judgment. I forced a smile, the kind of polite, neighborly smile I thought was required in places like Tranquility Court. Just me and my things. Aside, walking over to his low picket fence, I'm Clara Reed. Henderson had grunted, not offering a first name. He squinted at the movers. Tell them to be careful with the lawn. The HOO is very particular about the lawns. I'll be sure to, I said, my smile tightening. He gave a curt nod and retreated back into his house without another word. The screen door snapped shut behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very short, unpleasant sentence. I stood there for a moment, feeling a small, irrational prickle of unease. I dismissed it as post-divorce jitters. I was just sensitive. Rawa. I was looking for problems where there weren't any. I told the movers to be careful with the lawn, and I went back to the business of building my new, quiet life. For a few weeks, that's exactly what it was, quiet. I settled into a routine, morning coffee on the small back patio, hours lost in the digital worlds I created for my clients. Evenings with a book or a movie, the loudest sound was usually the whir of the dishwasher or the clink of ice in a glass. It was the sound of peace, or so I thought. The first official sign of trouble arrived not with a bang, but with a gentle ping of an incoming email. It was from the Tranquility Court, Homeowners Association. The subject line was bland, community guideline reminder. I opened it with a flicker of curiosity. I'd read the HOO bylaws before I bought the place. They seemed standard enough. No unapproved paint colors, lawns mowed weekly, trash cans hidden from street view. I was compliant on all fronts. The email was polite, almost friendly in its corporate speak. It spoke of maintaining a harmonious living environment for all residents and the shared responsibility of minimizing disturbances. Then it got to the point. We have received a complaint regarding excessive noise originating from your property, specifically late-night disturbances. I read the sentence 3 times. Excessive noise, late-night disturbances. I lived alone. My cat, a silent, fluffy creature named Ghost, was my only companion. My television was never turned up past a respectable volume. I didn't play music. I certainly didn't host parties. The complaint was, To put it mildly, utterly baffling. It had to be a mistake. They must have meant the boisterous family with 3 young boys on the other side of me. The email mentioned that the complaint had come from an adjoining neighbor. My heart sank a little. Henderson, it had to be. I spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious confusion. What could he possibly have heard? Was my computer fan too loud? Did I close a cupboard with too much force? The absurdity of it was infuriating, but the accusation itself, the formal black and white of the email, made me feel defensive and smell. The next afternoon, steeling myself, I walked over to his house. The lawn was, as ever, immaculate. A small, perfectly pruned rose bush stood sentinel by the porch steps. I rang the bell. It took a long time for him to answer, and when he did, he opened the door only a few inches, as if expecting a threat. "Mr. Henderson?" It began, trying to sound reasonable and calm. "Hi, it's Clara from next door. I received a strange email from the HOA yesterday about a noise complaint." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. / And? Well, it said it was from an adjoining neighbor, and I can't for the life of me figure out what noise they could be referring to. I was hoping you could shed some light on it. Was there something that bothered you? He looked me up and down, a slow, deliberate scan that made my skin crawl. This is a quiet neighborhood, Miss Reed. People move here for the peace and quiet. Some of us have to wake up early. We're not all freelancers. He said the word freelancers like it was a contagious disease. I understand that. Aside, my voice wavering slightly, I work from home, so I value the quiet as much as anyone. But what specifically was the noise? If you could just tell me, I'll be sure to stop doing it. He gave a short, humorless huff. It's a persistent thumping ... / in voices. Late at night, thumping, voices. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. The headboard of my bed was against the shared wall. Had I been tossing and turning too vigorously? Voices? Was my TV louder than I thought? But he'd said voices, plural. "Mr. Henderson, I live alone," I said, my frustration mounting. "There are no other voices. I promise you, my house is silent at night." He just shook his head slowly, a look of pitying disbelief on his face, as if I were a child telling a particularly inept lie. "The complaint has been filed." He sighed, his tone final. "I'd suggest you be more considerate." And with that, he closed the door. Not a snap this time, but a slow, quiet click that felt infinitely more dismissive. I walked back to my own house, the quiet sanctuary that now felt like a fishbowl. My every move scrutinized. The complaint wasn't a mistake. It was a message, and I had no idea why it had been sent. The seed of paranoia, once planted, grew with astonishing speed. Henderson's accusation, as besalus as it was, wormed its way into my consciousness. Suddenly, my quiet little house seemed fraught with sonic peril. Every footstep on the hardwood floor was a potential thump. Every creak of a floorboard, a late-night disturbance. I started to modify my behavior in ways that felt both necessary and insane. I bought a thick area rug for the bedroom, covering the floor so my steps would be muffled. I stopped watching movies in the living room, whose wall adjoined his house, and instead watched them on my laptop in the kitchen. On the opposite side, I put felt pads on the bottom of every cupboard door and drawer. I found myself tensing up every time I had to put a dish away, guiding it into the cabinet with the slow, deliberate care of a bone disposal expert. The silence I had once craved now became a source of anxiety. Was it quiet enough? Or was the lack of sound somehow suspicious? I started using headphones exclusively, even for work calls, terrified that my own voice, speaking to a client in California, would be misconstrued as one of the phantom voices. Henderson had mentioned my own home had become a cage of self-consciousness, I found myself walking on tiptoe, holding my breath as I moved from room to room. Ghost, my cat, would sometimes get the zoomies at night, a frantic, joyful dash across the house before I'd found it charming ... Now I found myself scooping him up, holding him tight, whispering, she, you have to be quiet, as if he were a co-conspirator in a plot I didn't understand. 2 weeks after my conversation with Henderson, the second email from the HOA arrived. This one was less friendly. This is a follow-up to our previous correspondence regarding ongoing noise complaints at your address. The latest report cites continued disturbances, specifically loud music and shouting on Tuesday evening. Tuesday evening, I pulled up my calendar, my heart pounding ... on Tuesday evening. I had been on a 2-hour video conference with a new client, a lucrative but demanding project that required my full attention. I had worn my noise-canceling headphones the entire time. The only shouting would have been the internal kind, screaming at my inability to get a logo design just right. The accusation was so specific, so demonstrably false, that for a moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated anger washed over me. He was lying. He was deliberately lying. But the anger was quickly replaced by a familiar, sinking feeling of helplessness. Who would believe me? I was the newcomer, the single woman, the freelancer. He was the established resident, the watchful guardian of the neighborhood's tranquility. I typed out a frantic, defensive reply to the HOA, explaining my whereabouts, offering to show them my call logs, anything to prove my innocence. I hit send and felt a profound sense of futility. I was playing a game where my opponent was setting the rules and also keeping the score, and every move I made, every quiet footstep and muffled cupboard door, felt like I was already losing. The peace I had moved here to find was dissolving into a constant, humming anxiety, a low-grade fear that the next email, the next accusation, was always just one misplaced footstep away. The third strike came in the form of a certified letter. The crisp, green and white envelope in my mailbox felt ominous even before I opened it. It was an official notice of violation from the HOO board. The language was cold and legalistic, citing 3 separate, documented complaints and a failure to rectify the ongoing nuisance. It came with a warning: a 4th complaint would result in a fine of $250. $250. The number seemed to leap off the page. It was no longer just a matter of my word against his. This was real. This had financial consequences. This could escalate. I decided I had to face them. I couldn't hide behind emails anymore. The notice mentioned the next monthly HOA meeting was in a week. I marked it on my calendar with a thick, angry red circle. I spent the week preparing, rehearsing what I would say, trying to craft a speech that was firm but not hysterical, reasonable but not a pushover. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of a nearby condominium complex that shared our HOA. The room was beige and soulless, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. About 15 people were scattered in folding chairs, most of them retirees. At the front of the room, a long table was occupied by the board, a stern-looking woman named Brenda. Who was the president? A man who looked perpetually bored, and another woman who just nodded at everything Brenda said. Been there. In the second row sat Mr. Henderson. He was dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khaki pants. He looked calm, respectable ... He caught my eye as I walked in and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if we were allies in some shared cause. The audacity of it made my blood run cold. When the agenda turned to resident concerns, Brenda looked down at her papers. We have the matter of the noise violations at 14 Tranquility Court. She looked directly at me ... Miss Reed. I believe you wanted to address the board. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the notes I'd prepared. Yes, thank you. I cleared my throat. My name is Clara Reed. I received a notice of violation this week, and I am here to state for the record that the complaints against me are completely unfounded. I laid it all out. How I lived alone, how I worked from home in a quiet profession, how the specific accusations of parties and shouting were impossible. I tried to keep my voice steady, to project an aura of calm rationality. When I finished, there was a polite, awkward silence. Brenda looked at Henderson. Mr. Henderson, since you are the complainant, would you care to respond? He stood up slowly. He didn't look at me. He addressed the room. Folks, I've lived on this street for 22 years. His voice was sorrowful, weary. I've never had to file a complaint against a neighbor before. Never, I believe in being neighborly, but the disturbances coming from that house, tumping, the shouting matches, it's just not right. It goes on at all hours. My wife is a light sleeper. It's affecting her health, ... I've tried to speak with Ms. Reed about it politely, but nothing has changed. Sat down. A murmur of sympathy went through the room. He had painted me as a callous, disruptive party animal and himself as the long-suffering victim. He was good. He was very good. Brenda looked at me, her expression a mixture of impatience and pity. Ms. Reed, we have a documented pattern of complaints from a long-standing resident. You are new to the community. Frankly, it's your word against his. The board has to take these reports seriously, but it's a lie. The words burst out of me, louder and more emotional than I'd intended. It's a complete fabrication. Brenda's lips thinned. We don't appreciate that kind of language. Ms. Reed, the warning stands. I suggest you take this matter seriously and make an effort to be a more considerate neighbor. I sank back into my chair, my face burning with humiliation. I looked around the room. No one would meet my eye. They saw a hysterical woman, a troublemaker. Henderson just stared straight ahead, the picture of stoic dignity. I felt utterly, completely alone. I had been tried and convicted in a beige, airless room by a jury of my supposed peers, and the truth hadn't mattered at all. The aftermath of the HO meeting was a quiet, suffocating blanket of defeat. I had been publicly branded a nuisance. The warning felt like a leash, shortening my every move. I walked around my own house like an intruder, flinching at every sound. The joy I'd initially found in my little sanctuary was gone, replaced by annoying resentment. Henderson, for his part, seemed emboldened by his victory. He no longer had to rely on the anonymity of the HOA. His harassment became more direct, more personal. He took to leaving little notes on my front door, tucked under the welcome mat. They were written as spidery, aggressive script on small squares of paper. Some of us have to wake up early. 6 a.m. is not an appropriate time for slamming car doors. I had left for an early morning appointment with a client. I hadn't slammed my door. That perfume you wear is quite pungent. The smell wafts over the fence. I had been gardening on my own patio. The notes were petty, absurd, but their cumulative effect was maddening. It was a form of psychological warfare. He was asserting his dominance, making it clear that my entire existence was subject to his approval. He was an omnipresent critic, and my life was the performance he had decided to pan. My work began to suffer. I missed a deadline for the first time in years because I was so consumed with anxiety that I couldn't focus on the complex design I was supposed to be creating. I found myself staring out the window that faced his property, watching him meticulously edge his lawn or polish his already gleaming car. A ball of helpless rage tightening in my stomach. The feeling of being watched was constant. If I sat on my back patio, I could feel his eyes on me from his kitchen window. If I took the trash out, his front door would open and he'd busy himself with some non-existent task on his porch. He was a sentinel, and I was his prisoner, the breaking point. The moment the frayed wires of my patience finally snapped came on a Saturday afternoon. I had dropped a heavy ceramic pot in the kitchen. It shattered on the tile floor with a tremendous crash. It was an accident, a simple, clumsy mistake, but my first thought wasn't about the mess. He heard that. A jolt of pure adrenaline, a fight or flight terror shot through me. And then the terror curdled into fury. I was living in fear of dropping a pot in my own goddamn kitchen. I was a 38-year-old woman, a homeowner, a professional, and I was being systematically tormented by a petty tyrant with a lawnmower. Something inside me shifted. It was a quiet, seismic event. The part of me that wanted to be polite, to be reasonable, to appease, simply withered and died. If I was going to be the villain in his story, then I might as well start acting like one, not by making noise, but by listening. I stood there for a long moment amidst the shards of ceramic. The mess forgotten, my anger was a clarifying force, burning away the fog of anxiety. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to be driven out of my home, and I certainly wasn't going to pay a $250 fine. For a lie, the game had changed. He had been watching me, judging me, documenting my every move. It was time, I decided, to return the favor. The police. He actually called the police. It was a Thursday night. I was curled up on my sofa, the one in the kitchen, watching an old black and white movie on my laptop. Headphones firmly in place. Ghost was asleep on my lap. The house was, by any sane person's definition, silent. The knock on the door was so loud it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, insistent pounding that rattled the door in its frame. My heart leaped into my throat. I scooped up the cat, my mind racing. Who would be knocking like that at 10 o'clock at night? I peered through the peephole and saw 2 uniformed police officers standing on my porch. Their presence was so incongruous, so utterly alien to my quiet life, that for a second I thought I was hallucinating. I opened the door, my face a mask of confusion. "Can I help you?" The older of the 2 officers looked at me, then at a notepad in his hand. "Ma'am, we've had a report of a disturbance at this address. A domestic dispute." A domestic dispute? I stared at him, bewildered. I gestured around my empty, silent entryway. "As you can see, I'm alone, unless you count the cat." The younger officer craned his neck, trying to peer past me into the house. His expression was a mixture of boredom and suspicion. It was the look of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. The report mentioned shouting, screaming, sounded like a man and a woman fighting. My blood ran ice cold. Henderson. This was a new level of escalation. This wasn't a passive-aggressive note or a complaint to the toothless HOA. This was the law. These were men with guns and the power to arrest me, standing on my doorstep because of a lie my neighbor had told them. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and sharp. I had to stand there in my pajamas and explain to 2 skeptical strangers that I was not, in fact, engaged in a screaming match with a phantom man in my kitchen. "Officers, I can assure you, you've been misinformed," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, has been filing false noise complaints against me for months. This is just his latest tactic." I was watching a movie on my laptop with headphones. I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They probably heard this all the time. The crazy neighbor story, the older officer sighed. Look, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them to get a warrant, but I knew that would only make me look guilty, defeated. A step to acid and be my guest. You won't find anyone. They did a cursory walk-through. Living room, kitchen. They poked their heads into the spare bedroom and my bedroom. The entire process took less than a minute. It was a profound violation. Basterile, official intrusion into my private space. When they were satisfied I was alone, they returned to the front door. All right. Scared, my voice shaking. He can just call you, tell a lie, and you show up at my door and search my house. Keeps happening, it becomes a different issue. But for tonight, just try to keep it down. Keep it down. The phrase echoed in my ears as I closed the door behind them. I leaned against it, my body trembling with rage. This was no longer about noise. This was about power. He was trying to prove that he could control my life, that he could invade my home with a single phone call. The humiliation burned. But the night at 8, something new was hardening. The fear was finally, irrevocably being baked into resolve. He had overplayed his hand. He had pushed me from victimhood into something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose. Appeasement was not an option. Defense was not enough. The only way to win this war was to launch a counteroffensive, and I knew. We issued in chilling clarity exactly where to begin my reconnaissance. The anger from the police visit didn't fade. It settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach, a constant source of fuel. My perspective had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the frazzled, anxious victim trying to prove her innocence. I was a strategist. My quiet little bungalow had become an observation post, and Mr. Henderson was now the subject of my undivided attention. I started watching him, not obsessively, not in a way that would be noticed, but with a quiet, meticulous purpose. I had an advantage. The window in my home office, the spare bedroom, looked directly out over his driveway and the side of his house, including his 2-car garage. It was the perfect vantage point. For the first few days, I just observed his routine. He was a man of rigid habits, out at 7 a.m. to fetch the paper, lawn mowed every Wednesday at 4 p.m., rain or shine, car washed every Saturday morning. It was a life of predictable, almost pathological order. But as I watched, I started to notice things that didn't quite fit the pattern. Small anomalies. There was the car. For instance, a beat-up, decade-old Honda Civic. It wasn't his. He drove a pristine, late-model Buick. The Honda would appear in the evenings, usually after dark, and park on the street just past his property line. A young woman, probably a college student from her backpack and tired expression, would get out. She never went to the front door. Instead, she'd walk quickly, almost furtively, down the narrow gravel path that ran along the side of Henderson's house and disappeared behind the garage. She would be gone before he left for his morning paper. Then there was the trash. Henderson was fastidious about his 2 city-issued bins, one for trash / one for recycling. But on Tuesday nights, long after the sun had set, I would sometimes see him carry a third, smaller, unmarked plastic trash can from behind the garage and dump its contents into his own bin before wheeling it to the curb. / It was a small detail, but it was off. It was an exception to his rigid, rule-bound world. And finally, there was the mail. Once, while watering the beleaguered petunias in my front garden, I saw the mail carrier deliver his post. A few minutes later, Henderson came out, collected his letters from the mailbox, and then did something strange. He glanced over at my house, and seeing me, he hesitated, but then he proceeded anyway. He walked over to a thick, overgrown azalea bush on the far side of his lawn, reached deep inside it, and pulled something out. It was a small, nondescript bundle of letters. He took them and went back inside. Secret mail drop. A clandestine trash run. A quiet, nocturnal visitor. Separately, they were just oddities, curiosities, but together, they started to paint a picture. Something was happening at the Henderson house that wasn't meant to be seen. My focus narrowed from the man himself to the one place all these anomalies seemed to center on, Ted Garage. The garage doors were always closed. I had never once seen them open, not even when he was washing his car right in front of them. The windows on the side of the garage, the ones that faced the gravel path, were covered from the inside with thick, heavy-looking curtains. It was a fortress, and I was beginning to suspect that my noisy, disruptive parties were nothing more than a smokescreen. A convenient distraction designed to keep anyone from looking too closely at what was going on inside it. My suspicion about the garage solidified into a working theory. Henderson wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a petty tyrant with a secret, and I was willing to bet that secret was a violation of some rule he held so dear when it applied to others. The hypocrisy was what truly galled me, what stoked the fire of my resolve. My quiet evenings, once spent trying to relax, were now dedicated to research. My graphic design skills, it turned out, translated well to amateur detective work. It was all about finding patterns, connecting disparate pieces of information, and presenting them in a clear, coherent way. I started with the basics, public records. I went to the county assessor's website and pulled up the property details for 16 Tranquility Court. It was listed as a single-family residence, 3 bedrooms/2 baths, with a 2-car garage, standard stuff. No permits for recent construction or major renovations were on file. Next, I dove into the city's zoning ordinances. I downloaded the entire municipal code, a document so dense and full of legalese it could cure the most stubborn case of insomnia. But I was driven. I searched for keywords: garage, conversion, rental, accessory dwelling unit. The rules were strict, just as I'd suspected. Converting a garage into a living space, what they called an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, required a slew of permits: building permits, electrical permits, plumbing permits. It required inspections, adherence to safety codes, and, most importantly, it had to be registered with the city and declared on property taxes. An unpermitted conversion was a serious violation that I looked into the HOS bylaws, the very document Brenda had sanctimoniously waved at me during the meeting. The rules were even stricter. ADS were forbidden unless explicitly approved by the Architectural Review Committee. A homeowner couldn't just decide to turn their garage into an apartment. It was a violation of the community's single-family residence zoning. The pieces were clicking into place. The young woman with the Honda was a tenant. The extra trash was her trash. The secret mail drop was for her mail. Henderson was running an illegal, off-the-books rental unit out of his garage. He was a slumlord in a polo shirt. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it all was what truly staggered me. This man, who had tormented me for weeks over the imagined sound of my footsteps, who had called the police because of a movie he couldn't possibly have heard, who wrapped himself in the righteous flag of HOA rules and community guidelines, was engaged in a flagrant and potentially dangerous violation of those very same rules. He had built his entire campaign against me on a foundation of lies, not just to be malicious, but to create a diversion. If the neighbors were busy watching the problem child in number 14, they wouldn't notice the quiet, illegal tenant in number 16. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. A slow smile spread across my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a sharp, predatory smile. The kind of smile a wolf might give right before it decides to stop playing with its food. Mr. Henderson had started a war of attrition, but he had made a fatal error. He had assumed I was unarmed. Just as my theory was solidifying, the catalyst I needed to push me from suspicion to action arrived in the mail. It was another envelope from the HOA. Not a certified letter this time, but a standard one. Inside was a bill, an invoice, fine for continued noise violation, $250. There it was, in stark black and white, the tangible result of his lies and the board's gullibility. Brenda had made good on. Her threat? They had ignored my defense, ignored the lack of any real evidence. And Sidad we'd hit established head resident. They had fined me $250 for living quietly in my own home. I stared at the invoice, and all the anxiety, all the fear I had felt was burned away by a clean, white-hot rage. This was no longer just a psychological game. This was theft. They were taking my money based on a fiction created by a hypocrite. That fine was the best thing that could have happened. It erased any lingering doubts I had about my course of action. It silenced the little voice in my head that whispered about stooping to his level. This was no longer about revenge. This was about justice. It was about defending myself against a coordinated attack. My amateur investigation was about to go professional, or as professional as a freelance graphic designer with a MacBook and a grudge kick. My first move was to document everything. I started a new file on my computer, titled simply Henderson. Inside, I created a timeline. I logged every complaint he had made, cross-referencing the date and time with my own calendar, and activity, complaint, loud party, 10 p.m. Friday. My activity, asleep, complaint, shouting, 8 p.m. Tuesday. My activity, on a client call with headphones, but my own logs weren't enough. I needed proof. I needed evidence that was undeniable. I needed to see what was happening on that gravel path and at that garage door when I wasn't glued to my office window. Spent an afternoon researching online. The sheer variety of home surveillance equipment was staggering. I settled on a small, discreet security camera, one that was weather-resistant and had night vision. It was marketed for monitoring porches for package thieves. I figured it would work just as well for monitoring a law-breaking neighbor. When it arrived, I felt a tremor of something that felt dangerously like excitement. I waited until after dark to install it. I mounted it high up under the eave of my roof, near the corner of the house. The position was perfect. It was aimed at my own side yard and driveway, a perfectly legal and legitimate placement for a security camera, but the wide-angle lens also captured a clear, unobstructed view of the public sidewalk, the street in front of Henderson's house, his entire driveway, and, most importantly, the gravel path and the side door to his garage. I linked the camera to my computer. The live feed popped up on my screen. It was high definition. The black and white night vision crisp and clear. I could see the front of his house, the dark windows, the immaculate lawn shimmering under the moonlight. I sat there, watching the silent feed, and felt the balance of power shift. In a fundamental way, for months, I had been the one who was watched. You could and documented. Now, I was the watcher. I had my own evidence. My own record. The game was a foot ... and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance to win. The security camera was a revelation. It was a silent, sleepless witness, and it didn't take long for it to confirm everything I suspected. The footage it captured was more damning than I could have hoped for. The pattern of the young woman's arrivals and departures became crystal clear. She would park her Honda down the street, always just out of the direct line of sight of Henderson's front windows, and scurry down the gravel path to a small, barely visible door at the side of the garage. She had her own key. She never once knocked. This was her home. The camera, with its sensitive microphone, picked up snippets of conversation as Henderson interacted with his tenant. The audio was faint, often just murmurs, but it was enough. I heard him one evening, his voice a low grumble. Just keep the television down. The new neighbor is sensitive. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He was using me, his fictional sensitive neighbor, as a tool to keep his illegal operation quiet. One Tuesday night, I hit the jackpot. The camera recorded the tenant leaving with her small, unmarked trash can. She walked down the path and left it at the side of the garage. An hour later, The footage showed Henderson's side door opening. He emerged, looked left and right like a B-movie villain, picked up her trash can, and dumped its contents into his own large city bin before scurrying back inside. It was a perfect, time-stamped piece of evidence. The most compelling footage came on a rainy Saturday. The camera showed the tenant running out of the garage door in a panic. She ran to Henderson's front door and knocked. When he answered, I could hear her panicked voice carried on the damp air. Mr. Henderson, the pipe under the sink is leaking again. There's water all over the floor. The pipe under the sink. A sink meant plumbing. Plumbing that wasn't on any city permit. The footage that followed was pure gold. Henderson, looking furious and flustered, grabbed a toolbox from his back patio and rushed to the garage. He didn't call a plumber. Of course he didn't. You can't call a licensed plumber to fix an illegal, unpermitted sink. The camera recorded him going in and out of the garage for the next hour, carrying tools, muttering to himself. He was fixing it himself, trying to contain the evidence of his secret. I saved the clip, labeling it illegal plumbing. I saved the clip of the trash can transfer. I saved a dozen clips of the tenant coming and going. My evidence folder, once just a collection of my own notes, was growing into a formidable archive of his deceit. I began to compile the case. I was methodical, approaching it like a design project. I wanted the final presentation to be so clear, so overwhelming, that it will be irrefutable. I created a new timeline, this one illustrated. On one side, I listed Henderson's formal complaints against me. On the other, I placed a time-stamped still image from my camera footage, showing what was actually happening at his property at that exact moment, 7:15 p.m. Complaint, loud music, juxtaposed with 7:15 p.m. Tenant from 16 Tranquility Court arriving home from work, 11 p.m. Complaint, shouting and fighting. Juxtaposed with 11 p.m. Henderson sneaking tenant's trash into his own bin. The narrative it told was damning ... It wasn't just a case of he said, she said. It was a case of he said, here's the video. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I put it all together. The hurt and humiliation he had caused were still there, but they were now secondary to the mission. I was no longer just reacting to his attacks. I was building a case. I was the prosecutor, the lead investigator, and tester witness. And soon, very soon, court would be in session, watching the tenant come and go. I started to see her as more than just a component of Henderson's scheme. She was young, probably, not much older than 20. She looked perpetually exhausted, dragging her backpack home late at night and leaving again in the early morning. I pieced together from her snippets of conversation caught on camera that she was a nursing student at the local community college, likely working a job on the side to make ends meet. A part of me felt a sharp pang of sympathy for her. She was probably desperate for affordable housing in a town where there was little to be had. Henderson was likely exploiting that desperation, offering her a cheap, albeit illegal and unsafe, place to live. She was caught in his web, a pawn in his game against me. Did she know about his campaign of harassment? Did she know that her quiet footsteps on the concrete floor of the garage were being twisted into late-night thumping in his complaints? One evening, the camera's microphone picked up a conversation that answered that question. Henderson had stopped her on the path as she was leaving. I just want to remind you. Aside, his voice low and conspiratorial. Be extra quiet this week. The woman next door. The one I told you about. She's been making trouble, complaining to the HOA. We wouldn't want them getting the wrong idea about anything. Would we? The tenant just nodded meekly ... Yes. Mr. Henderson, I'm always quiet. He was coaching her. He was using her as an unknowing accomplice, framing me as the neighborhood troublemaker to ensure her silence and complicity. Any sympathy I had for her was now complicated by a bitter resentment. She might be a victim of his exploitation, but she was also a party to the fraud. That was costing me my peace of mind and my money. I wrestled with it for a few days. Should I try to talk to her? Warn her? But what would I say? Hi, I'm the crazy neighbor your landlord warned you about. And by the way, your apartment is an illegal death trap. She had every reason to side with him, to deny everything. Held the power of her housing in his hands. Confronting her would be a mistake. It would tip my hand to Henderson, and he would just double down. Hide his tracks better? No, my path was clear. My fight was not with her. She was a symptom. Henderson was the disease. I had to focus on the source of the problem. She would be collateral damage. Yes, and I didn't feel good about that. She would have to find a new place to live, and I hoped she would find somewhere safe and legal, but I could not, and would not sacrifice my own security for hers. My responsibility was to myself, to the sanctuary I had tried to build. The decision hardened my resolve. Henderson had not only victimized me, he had victimized this young woman, putting her in an unsafe dwelling and using her as a sand. He felt no loyalty to her, only to the $500 or $600 a month she was probably paying him in cash. I would feel no remorse in exposing him. He had sown the wind, and he was about to reap the whirlwind, the final piece of evidence. The one that sealed the deal in my mind came not from my camera, but from my own two eyes. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was in my office, trying to work, but my attention, as it so often was now, was half focused on the world outside my window. I saw the tenant, his nursing student, walking down the gravel path toward the street. She was on her phone, and se mid-agitated. She stopped at the end of the driveway, waiting to cross the street, and I could hear her conversation clearly through my open window. No, I told him it's a fire hazard. She was saying, her voice tight with frustration, the wiring is so sketchy. The breaker trips if I try to use the microwave and the space heater at the same time. He just told me not to use them at the same time. A space heater? Of course, the garage wouldn't have its own heating system. It would be cold and damp in the winter. A space heater running on overloaded, unpermitted wiring, it wasn't just a code violation. It was a genuine danger. What if that faulty wiring started a fire? The garage was attached to his house. It was only 20 feet from my house. Her next words sent a chill down my spine. I know it's cheap, Mom, but I'm scared something bad is going to happen. He told me if I complain, he'll just kick me out and deny I ever lived here. She hung up the phone, looked around nervously, and hurried across the street to her car. Sat at my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. This changed everything. This went beyond petty harassment and zoning violations. This was about safety. His greed and deceit were putting not just her, but me, my cat, my home, at risk. Any lingering guilt I had about the consequences for the tenant evaporated in that moment. I wasn't just getting revenge anymore. I wasn't just trying to get my $250 back. I was acting in self-defense. I was preventing a potential disaster born from one man's arrogance and avarice. I turned back to my computer, my file. My meticulously organized case against Henderson was no longer just a tool for justice. It was a weapon, and I was finally ready to use it. I spent the rest of the day polishing the report, embedding the video clips, writing out a clear, concise summary of the facts. I double-checked the municipal codes I was citing. I made sure every claim I made was backed up by an image, a video, or a public document. When I was done, I looked at the final product. It was a digital sledgehammer. It was undeniable. It was powerful. And it was aimed squarely at the foundation of lies Mr. Henderson had so carefully constructed. The time for surveillance was over. The time for action had begun. My first move was not to the HOA. I knew better now. The HOO board was biased and ineffective. They were concerned with appearances, wheat maintaining a fragile, superficial piece. A he said, she said dispute was one thing, but presenting them with evidence of a serious legal violation committed by a long-standing resident would force them into a position they would hate, having to take real, consequential action against one of their own. It would be messy, and they would resent me for it. No, I would go over their heads. I would start with the entity that had real power, real teeth, the city. I found the phone number for the city's code enforcement department on the municipal website. My heart was pounding as I dialed, but my voice was steady when the receptionist answered. I didn't give my name. I didn't want this to be seen as a neighborly dispute, at least not at first. I wanted it to be an objective, official investigation. I'd like to report a potential code violation, I said, keeping my voice calm and businesslike. It's regarding an illegal garage conversion to a residential dwelling at 16 Tranquility Court. I gave the dispatcher the facts. And only the facts: the presence of a full-time tenant, the lack of permits on file, the separate entrance, the self-repaired plumbing, the dangerous wiring mentioned by the tenant. I didn't mention Henderson's harassment campaign. I didn't mention the noise complaints. I presented it as a concerned citizen reporting a safety issue. The dispatcher was professional and efficient. She took down the address and the details. Okay, we'll open a case file and send an inspector out to take a look within the next 5 to 7 business days. She sighed. 5 to 7 business days. It felt like an eternity, but it was a start. A real official process was now in motion, completely independent of me. The waiting was agonizing. Every time a car I didn't recognize drove down our street, my head would snap up. I watched Henderson's house like a hawk. He seemed oblivious, going about his rigid routine with the same smug certainty as always. He even left another note on my door. Your recycling bin is overflowing. It's an eyesore. I almost laughed. I crumpled it up and threw it in the offending bin. His reign of petty terror was coming to an end. He just didn't know it yet. On the 6th business day, it had pinned. I was at my desk when a white city-owned pickup truck pulled up and parked directly in front of Henderson's house. A man in a collared shirt with a city logo on. It got out, holding a clipboard. The inspector had arrived. I shrank back from my window so I wouldn't be seen, but I had a perfect view. I watched as the inspector rang the doorbell. / Henderson answered. His expression initially, one of mild annoyance at the interruption. The inspector said something, and I saw Henderson's entire demeanor change. His back stiffened, his face darkened. They spoke for several minutes on the porch. There was a lot of gesturing. The inspector pointed toward the garage. Henderson shook his head vehemently. The inspector was firm, professional. Henderson was becoming more and more agitated. He was a man who was used to being in control, and the official, unimpressed authority of the city inspector was clearly rattling him. The crucial moment came when the inspector gestured toward the garage and took a step down the driveway. He was asking to see inside. Henderson blocked his path. He physically stood in the way, shaking his head, his voice growing louder even though I couldn't make out the words. The inspector stood his ground for a moment, then made a note on his clipboard, gave Henderson a crisp nod, and walked back to his truck. He hadn't gotten inside, but it didn't matter. Denying access to a city inspector during an official investigation was, I knew from my research, almost as damning as the violation itself, it implied. There was something to hide. Henderson stood on his porch, watching the truck drive away. He looked small and furious. The mask of the respectable, peace-loving neighbor had slipped, and underneath was an ugly, panicked face. He knew he'd been caught, and I had a strong suspicion he knew exactly who had caught him. The city inspector's visit was like poking a hornet's nest with a stick. Henderson didn't know for sure that I was the one who had reported him, but he was a man who saw enemies everywhere, and I was his primary target. The day after the inspector left, the retaliation began. It was clumsy, panicked, and far more aggressive than anything he had done before. He must have been watching me, waiting for me to leave. I had a meeting with a client downtown. As I walked to my car, he stormed out of his house and confronted me in my own. Driveway ... I know it was you. Hisso Ted, his face blotchy and red. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw, sputtering rage. You've been spying on me, stalking me. I was startled by the suddenness of it, but I didn't let it show. I continued. Walking toward my car, I have no idea what you're talking about. Mr. Henderson, aside, my voice cold and even, don't play dumb with me. He jabbed a finger in my direction. You made a false report to the city. You're harassing me. I'm a senior citizen. This is elder abuse. The accusation was so ludicrous, it was almost funny. He, the architect of a months-long campaign of psychological harassment, was claiming to be the victim. He was twisting my act of self-defense into an attack. You should be more careful about who you accuse. Mr. Henderson, aside, unlocking my car, making a false report to the police is a crime. You know, it was a shot in the dark, but it hit its mark. A flicker of fear crossed his face. He knew he was on shaky ground. But his anger quickly overwhelmed it. You'll regret this. Hespit, as I got into my car and closed the door, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I drove away, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The confrontation had been unpleasant, but it was also revealing he was panicking, he was losing control of the narrative, and it was making him reckless. His recklessness culminated in his final, dispirited Gamby. 2 days later, the police were at my door again, the same 2 officers as before. This time, the older one looked genuinely weary. Ma'am, he sighed. Before I could even speak, Mr. Henderson has filed a formal complaint. He's alleging that you are stalking him. He claims you have cameras pointed at his house and that you're following his movements. He says he feels unsafe. This time, I was ready. The fear and humiliation I had felt during their first visit were gone. In their place was a cold, hard confidence. Officers, I've been expecting this. I said calmly ... I stepped back from the door. Please, come in. I have something you need to see. I led them not to my kitchen, but to my home office. On my large monitor, I had the Henderson file open. I gestured for them to look. Mr. Henderson's accusations are not only false. They are a deliberate attempt to intimidate a witness to his own illegal activities, I said, my voice ringing with the authority I had earned. I walked them through it, the timeline of his escalating baseless noise complaints, the official fine from the HOA, and then the evidence. I played the video of him sneaking his tenant's trash. I played the video of him fixing the illegal plumbing. I showed them the clear shot of the tenant coming and going from the garage. I explained that the camera was legally placed to monitor my own property and that it only incidentally captured his driveway and the public street. He's harassing me because I am a witness to this. I explained, he's running an unpermitted and, frankly, dangerous illegal rental unit out of his garage. I reported it to code enforcement, and an inspector came out 2 days ago. This stalking complaint, it's witness intimidation, plain and simple. The 2 officers stared at the screen, then at each other. The younger one's bored expression was gone, replaced by a flicker of interest. The older one's weary demeanor had sharpened into something more serious. They were no longer looking at a hysterical woman. They were looking at a mountain of evidence. The older officer pointed at the screen. Can you make us a copy of all this? I already have, aside, holding up a USB drive. One for you, one for the HOA, and one for my lawyer. just in case he took the drive. All right, Miss Reed, we'll look into this. Don't worry, we'll be having another chat with Mr. Henderson. As they left, ik knipte tijd had torned. This was no longer my word against his. The truth was now on a USB drive. In the hands of the law, the final act was about to begin, with the police now in possession of the truth. It was time to deal with the other head of the Hydra, the HOA. They had enabled Henderson. They had ignored me, fiended me, and judged me without a shred of evidence. Now they were going to have to face the consequences of their gullibility. I emailed Brenda, the HOA president, and the other board members. The subject line was direct: formal complaint and appeal of fine regarding 14 and 16 Tranquility Court. In the email, I formally requested an emergency hearing. I stated that I had irrefutable evidence that the noise complaints against me were fabricated as part of a campaign of harassment by Mr. Henderson, designed to distract from his own significant violations of both city ordinances and HOA bylaws. I attached the entire Henderson file to the email, the timeline, the photos, the video clips, everything. I also mentioned, quite deliberately, that a copy of this evidence was now in the possession of the local police department as part of an investigation into witness intimidation. The response was almost instantaneous. Brenda called me less than 10 minutes after I sent the email. Her tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was panicked. Miss Reed, I received your email, Seth stammered. This is a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation. Brenda, aside, my voice is cold and hard as steel. It's a fact. And I have the proof. The same proof the police now have. Your board fined me $250 based on the lies of a man who is breaking the law and endangering this neighborhood. I want a formal hearing to present my evidence and appeal that fine. And I want it this week. She agreed immediately. An emergency executive session was scheduled for Wednesday evening in the same beige, soulless clubhouse. When I walked in this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The usual smattering of residents wasn't there. It was just the 3 board members at their table, me in a chair on one side of the room, and Mr. Henderson, who had been summoned by the board, on the other. He looked pale and shrunken. The smugness was gone, replaced by a sour, resentful glare. He knew he was walking into an ambush. Brenda started the meeting. Her voice strained ... We are here to discuss a complaint filed by Ms. Reed. Ms. Reed, the floor is yours ... I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. I had a laptop with me ... I placed it on the table in front of me and turned the screen so the board could see. There's no need for a long speech. Aside, the evidence speaks for itself. For months, Mr. Henderson has claimed I am a nuisance. In reality, he is the nuisance and the liability. I began the presentation. Calmly, methodically, I walked them through the evidence. I showed them the videos, the trash can switch, the tenants' comings and goings, the conversation about the faulty wiring ... the clip of Henderson hastily fixing the illegal plumbing. With each click, with each new piece of evidence, I could see the color draining from the board members' faces. They looked from the screen to me, to Henderson, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally to fury. They had been played. Their authority had been used to perpetrate a fraud. When I got to the part about my report to code enforcement, I presented them with the cherry on top. I had called the department that morning. I held up a piece of paper. This is a copy of the official notice of violation issued by the city to Mr. Henderson 2 days ago. I announced he has been ordered to cease and desist operating an illegal dwelling, pay a fine of $2,000 for the violation, and another $500 for denying the inspector access. He has 30 days to return the garage to its original non-residential state. or face further legal action. A collective gasp went through the room. It was over. The final, official nail in his coffin. I turned my gaze to Henderson. He was staring at the table, his knuckles white. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anyone. As for the noise complaints, I continued, my voice ringing with finality. They were a smokescreen, a fiction designed by Mr. Henderson to paint me as a problem neighbor so that no one would pay attention to his own illegal, dangerous, and profitable secret. I trust the board will now see fit to retract the fine they levied against me and take appropriate action against the man who has so flagrantly violated the trust of this community. I leaned back in my chair. I had said my piece. I had presented my case. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a liar being exposed. It was the sound of the truth. Crashing down like an avalanche, the climax of the hearing was not a shouting match, but a quiet, devastating implosion. All eyes turned to Henderson. Brenda, her face a mask of cold fury, spoke first. Mr. Henderson, do you have anything at all to say in response to this? He looked up, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. He tried to muster one last shred of his old bluster. She's twisting everything. He stammered, his voice thin and reedy. She spied on me. Illegally. She's obsessed with me. I didn't say a word. I just met his gaze. My expression calm. The evidence was too overwhelming. His sputtering denial sounded pathetic. Desperate, the bored-looking man on the board, who I now realized wasn't bored but just quietly observant, spoke up for the first time. The issue of her camera is irrelevant. Frank, his voice cutting through Henderson's. Whining. The camera's placement is legal. The issue is what it recorded. It recorded you running an illegal business out of your garage, in direct violation of city law and Section 7B of the HOA bylaws that you yourself voted to approve. It recorded you lying to this board, repeatedly. Henderson deflated. He slumped in his chair, a man utterly and completely defeated. He had built his world on a foundation of rules, and he had been crushed by the weight of them. Brenda cleared her throat, her authority returning now that the path was clear. The board finds in favor of Ms. Reed. The $250 fine is immediately rescinded, with our sincerest apologies. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of respect in her eyes. She then turned back to Henderson. As for you, Frank, the board is imposing the maximum possible fine for the violation, which is $1,000. Furthermore, you will receive a formal letter of censure. Any further complaints from you against any neighbor will be summarily dismissed unless accompanied by verifiable third-party evidence, and if you do not comply with the city's order to dismantle that illegal unit within the 30-day time frame, the HOA will begin its own legal proceedings to force compliance. Are we clear? He just nodded, staring at his hands. The meeting was adjourned. I packed up my laptop. The feeling of victory is strange, hollow hum in my chest, as I was leaving. Henderson was still sitting there, a solitary, gray figure, in a beige room. He looked up as I passed, and his eyes were filled with a venomous, impotent hatred he had lost. He knew it, and he knew that I was the one who had beaten him. I didn't smile. I didn't glow. I just met his gaze for a second, gave it a smell, almost imperceptible nod, and walked out the door into the cool night air. The aftermath was quiet, not the anxious, fragile quiet I had lived with before, but a deep, profound silence that felt earned. It was the sound of peace. Within a week, the young nursing student was gone. I saw her pack her few belongings into her Honda Civic one afternoon. She didn't look at my house. She'd just got in her car and drove away. I felt a momentary pang of something guilt, pity, but it passed. I had done what I had to do. I hoped she found a better, safer place. Then the construction began. Henderson hired a contractor, a legitimate, licensed one this time, to dismantle the illegal apartment. For 2 weeks, the air was filled with the sounds of hammers and saws, the sounds of his secret being torn apart. They ripped out the illegal plumbing, tore down the drywall, removed the kitchenette. One day, the big garage door, the one I had never seen open, was rolled up. The space inside was just a garage again, empty, dusty concrete, a hollowed-out shell of his deception. Mr. Henderson became a ghost. He no longer performed his meticulous lawn care rituals. His car stayed in the driveway. I rarely saw him come or go. The smug, watchful sentinel was gone, replaced by a recluse. We never spoke again. If our paths crossed when I was getting the mail, he would turn and walk quickly back into his house. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably reversed. He was afraid of me. The fines were paid. The HOA sent me a formal letter of apology. The police detective called to inform me that, given the circumstances, they would be filing Henderson's stalking complaint as unfounded. The war was officially over. I found myself slowly, cautiously reclaiming my space. I started playing music in the living room again, not loud, but at a volume that pleased me. I walked around my house with normal footsteps. I put dishes away without thinking about it. I bought a new ceramic pot, a big, beautiful one, and placed it in the kitchen. One sunny Saturday afternoon, I was on my back patio, sketching in a notebook, when Ghost, my cat, suddenly took off, zipping across the lawn in a burst of pure/unadulterated joy. I watched him, and smiled, a real Ganymede smile. The peace I had found wasn't the peace I had originally sought. I had moved to Tranquility Court looking for a quiet place to hide, a sanctuary from the world, but the world had followed me here in the form of a petty tyrant with a secret. And in fighting him, I had learned that true sanctuary isn't a place you can buy. It's not about silence or the absence of conflict. It's about finding the strength to stand your ground. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can and will fight for your own peace. And that was a foundation far stronger than any wall, a silence far more profound than any I had ever known.